Catherine Harnish, Principal at Leap Forward Library Consulting, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Grounding Our Adventure, Definitional Alignment as our Terra Firma, the second webinar in our Orienteering for Libraries and Librarians series. Before we get rolling today, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First of all, we've prepared and sent each registrant several documents to support this session. A handout on what to do if you or we experience any technical difficulties with our webinar platform, as well as a set of definitions that we'll review during today's session. You may want to reference these during our presentations. For ease of use, there are links under the handout section on the right-hand side of the screen here in the webinar platform as well. Second, we very much encourage the use of the chat function during the session, as we think that discussion is really important to these topics. We will, however, hold questions until the end, and for any that we don't have a chance to tackle, we'll follow up on the Leap Forward blog. And finally, we're recording today's session, and we'll make sure that all of you receive a link to it, as well as copies of our slides and speakers notes, complete with links to any cited resources by Friday of this week. In addition, all of our session materials are posted to the IMT website for your reference. So let's begin with a quick round of introductions. I'm joined today by my colleagues from Information Management Team, Nanette Knott, Principal at IMT, and Kathy Sackman, Lead Analyst. Together, we're working on solutions that help libraries ensure ongoing visibility and viability in a web-based world. Nanette and Kathy bring extensive experience with product and content development, architecture, ontology, and modeling services for publishers, libraries, and their partners, while I've spent the past 18 years in various ILS product management positions at ProQuest, OCLC, and Ex Libris. As the library industry looks toward the future, it's critically important that we know ourselves, that we understand who we are and why we're here. I talked about many of these identity issues in our last session. We're collectors, we're navigators, we're guardians, and so on. But we need to go further to get to what's essential, to think really critically about how we define ourselves, our services, and our value. Are we collectors like our museum colleagues? Or are we service providers offering a comprehensive set of knowledge services against what we collect and beyond? Or are we both? Are we navigators traveling alongside our users to facilitate pathways through information? Or should we be enabling navigation in the way that Google does? Or do we do both? What does it mean to guard the intellectual record? How are we rethinking our role as stewards of our collections in view of the trends and activities described in OCLC's Stewardship of the Evolving Scholarly Record, from the invisible hand to conscious coordination? How are we re-envisioning stewardship in view of a shift to increasingly electronic collections? Excuse me. We need to get to this essence before we start building strategy, building systems, building our future. Because if we don't understand very clearly who we are and what we do, we won't create the right solutions. In fact, I would argue that as an industry, we should have gotten to this essence before we started creating so-called next-generation library management systems. As a result, we've rebuilt rather than redefined or future-proof. We've achieved parity plus with our former systems, but have we achieved anything that will preserve our relevance for our users or within our organizations? Ask yourself, what is the ROI on the implementation of a next-gen system? How much is your library really saving in doing so? How much more effectively are you delivering services to your users in these environments? And how much more visible and viable are you? My sense is that there are some very hard answers here. Which brings us to the topic of today's session, definitional alignment as that grounding force, that thing that we need to do in order to get our essence before we move forward to avoid repeating our past mistakes. Stakeholders often have different understandings of terminology, As an example, my niece serves in the Navy on the destroyer USS John Paul Jones. When she thinks of a boat, she envisions a great big boat with great big guns. I live in northern Maine, not far from the famous Allagash Waterway, and when I think of a boat, I picture a much more placid scene featuring canoes. A common vocabulary ensures that everyone has the same understanding of the words we're using. As Nanette noted in the last session, we need to increase our collaboration, bringing in partners across the library, technical, and business aspects of our organizations and service providers to achieve our goals of visibility and viability in a web-based world. Without shared understandings, we've been talking at cross purposes with these partners, like ships passing in the night. As a result, the solutions we've created are unlikely to meet anyone's needs, whether they're functional, technical, or financial. This is evident in the answers to those previous questions about next-generation systems. We're not getting substantially better workflows. We're not getting the benefits of modern technology. We're not seeing a return on our institutions' investments in these systems. But before we even start talking about other stakeholders from outside of library, I would assert that we don't have common vocabulary within libraries, either writ large or often even within a single organization or a single team. Therefore, we get twisted up, unable to come to consensus about priorities, strategies, and how we deliver services. I mentioned in our last session that my mom is also a librarian. She was trained in the late 1960s and worked until her retirement in 1998 as a school librarian. While we share the same profession, we most definitely do not share the same vocabulary because we've worked at different times in different contexts with different constituents. In short, our business cases differ, and as a result, in many cases, our opinions differ as well. Coming to agreement on definitions is a really hard process, and if you're not butting heads, you're probably not doing it right. And we need to butt heads as we need to have our own story nailed down. We need to be clear in how we describe what we want before we start engaging with other stakeholders. I will say, however, that it's an unreasonable expectation that there will ever be universal agreement. Different business cases will give rise to different schemas, different solutions, different systems. There's no need for a law library and a medical library, for example, to come to complete agreement. Where there's a need for divergence, it's okay. In fact, it's actually vital to visibility and viability. Too often, librarians believe that there's only one way, but the reality is that there are many valid ways that work optimally in different situations. I recently left a product management position in which I was responsible for conceptualizing a next-generation management system. For me, it was important to do things differently, to improve our processes, and to respond to customer needs in a way that no one else was. So I brought in partners, IMT in fact, that complemented my team's library expertise with the right technology focus. And unlike previous forays into this work, we as a group spent a significant amount of time right at the outset on definitions. We went through an exhaustive process of documenting all of the terms that were flying around and then defining them in a consistent way. We knew that without these definitions, we'd end up with inconsistent inputs, requirements and specifications from the product team, the things that our technical counterparts would act upon. And on the outbound side, once all of that coding was complete, we wouldn't be able to verify that we were getting what we asked for in our testing. Once we had those definitions, once we thought critically about the meaning of each and how they fit into our stated goal of connecting resources to people, we were able to begin categorizing things, finding relationships, consolidating, and even discarding some of the terms. This then enabled us to categorize, relate, consolidate, and discard functionality. This process was designed to enable my team to develop the simplest, most cost-effective solution. We didn't want to invest unnecessary effort in developing a big, complicated system that increased our costs as a provider and your costs as a library. Instead, we wanted to help you answer those ROI questions I posed earlier with positive answers to ensure that we were addressing the real business needs of the library. And this is how you get to return on investment. With this kind of clarity, which all starts with definitions, it became much easier to reinvent, to transform, to think differently about what's essential to libraries. And from there, we could build new strategies and new solutions with confidence that we'd meet user needs and expectations. Similarly, much of the writing I've done on behalf of Leap Forward Library Consulting is informed by the benefit of clear, consistent definitions and the assessment that's enabled by them. Let me take a moment to explore an example. I'll explain how my thinking about ILSs, our integrated library systems, has changed thanks to this process. So historically, we've thought about our library management systems as a series of workflow-oriented applications that fit together to support the overall life cycle of a collection of resources, our library inventory. We purchase, we describe, we deliver in an integrated end-to-end process that creates and manages our physical inventory. And traditional library system design largely parallels these processes. But if we look critically at this, if we define our terms appropriately, a new picture emerges. Description, for example, is a siloed library-specific activity, often carried out manually in support of inventory management. It's more about describing what we own than about providing context for creative works in a complex web of knowledge. It's about the business of serving our collection, not about the business of our patrons using those collections. We describe so that we can order and invoice the right resources. We describe to enable users, whether they're internal or external, to locate the right resources. We describe to deliver the right resources to these users in our systems for our individual inventories. Thinking about description differently changed my perspective on the ILS and led me to think about it as an IMS, or an inventory management system, instead. We still need to manage context through the activities of metadata aggregation, creation, and curation. And note here that I intentionally switched from my use of the word description, but our definitions enable us to separate inventory management from context management. In fact, with IMT, we did define both of those terms, which appear in our vocabulary list here. Before we go on, I'll just take a moment to pop these two definitions up so that you can better understand the distinction I'm drawing between inventory management, managing physical things in the collection, and context management, managing relationships within and between things. To play things out a little further, we could take some of the fundamental components of that IMS, the inventory model, many of our acquisitions transactions, and most aspects of distribution, and leverage what's being done in other domains because we now share definitions with them. We could look to the expertise of organizations for which inventory management is a core competence, like Amazon and Walmart, and learn from best practices established in other domains, as the net suggested was necessary in our last session. We could simplify our business processes and rules, especially given that the physical collections that comprise our inventories today represent much less of our spending and use. And here, I would argue it's not just could, but must. The effort we continue to make in print collection management, both in libraries and in the ILS companies that support them, is distracting us, preventing us from leaping forward to meet organizational and user expectations in a web-based world. And we could better align how libraries work with the way that other supply chains work, particularly in the publishing space, to streamline workflows, reduce costs, and accelerate resource delivery. Talk about return on investment. And all of this stems from clear definitions, from taking a pile of words and sorting them out, from understanding the connections between them like this crossword puzzle. Admittedly, I jumped into the deep end with my example of defining inventory and context management, but never fear. Nanette's going to take a step back now and go through some more basic definitions, things that are the building blocks that enable the kind of transformed thinking that I just went through. So over to you, Nanette.
Thanks, Catherine. And you're right. We will take a step back and look at those things, those essences, the isness definitions, if you will. But first, let's take a page from a cherished mentor's playbook of mine, Barbara Tillett. Let's inject a little fun. Let's suspend disbelief and dream for a moment of what we can be, of what we want to be. Let's step through the door and envision the library we want to live and work in tomorrow, when all of this transition, all of this transformation is done. For as Barbara so eloquently suggested back then, we all need a break from time to time, a break from the hard work of becoming, a place just to be, a place where we can connect with our work with ourselves. And this space, this dream, this is the isness that informs our essential definition. It acts as a fence around them, bounding them to both reality and aspiration. So last, unfortunately, those cherished Firma glasses are, well, a bit dated and honestly slightly out of fashion. So let's put on Catherine's Library 2.0 glasses instead, Google glasses, if you will, and maybe slip into a pair of social media jeans. And yes, these are a real thing. I found them in a piece entitled 10 Wearable Tech Gadgets Librarians and Everyone Else Can't Live Without. And with our focus thus removed from that view immediately in front of us, let's use the enhanced reality of those Google glasses just for a moment to ask ourselves, what do our systems look like now? Wow, they're actually smaller, much smaller. The IMS is a back office tool. It's just for inventory and print distribution. The IMS is simply the ILS without the overhead of all those unified print workflows stretched to their breaking points with e-resource shove-in. For as we can all see pretty clearly now with our adjusted focus, those commonly accepted ILS workflows certainly are not best practices. In fact, their underlying premises, print, relational database management, flat file string-based data, dooms them to do little more than stuffing a cat in a jar. As we can see now with our Google glasses, that's a very bad idea, and it's likely to limit our forward movement and its functionality. And if not done right, without the proper opening for air, it's likely to limit life itself, or that viability Catherine was talking about. And it's likely to make people very mad, patrons, funders, staff, and even those uncomfortable detractors in our environment who are looking for a reason to end library and take over our funding for themselves. Sound familiar to any managers out there? Anyone working on a strategic plan? It's likely to cause large amounts of damage to ourselves and others when that tortured cat, those e-resources, are finally let out or they escape their internally imposed containment. Come on, you didn't actually believe cats put themselves in jars, did you? Look at that. Our systems serve people, not collections. They remove the antiquated system constraints and allow the service of library to come to the foreground. Personally, I see it like coming to the top layer when I'm doing a graphic with the system fading into the back as an unseen or hidden layer almost, where it should be, and service floating to the top as the display layer. Yes, through my Google glasses, I'm seeing Catherine's system that allows librarians to be librarians again, where the library and librarian serve people with their collections behind them, like in this picture, and their systems underneath them, like that hidden layer, supporting their service, rather than in front of them as they are now, dominating and constricting their vision. But what then do these smaller people systems look like, Nanette, you might ask, if they don't look like an ILS or a database? And what are we doing in them if we're not maintaining the system, our collection, and its metadata? Well, let's contrast and compare. They certainly aren't authority control. Authority control are names that represent things but aren't really things. In a shadow-like word cloud, if you will, which word clouds are always hard to make sense of. And if we're honest, isn't this exactly what library authority control looks like in an ILS area? It's a name, hoping that it's a thing. But when we put our Google glasses on, it becomes like. But when we put our Google glasses on, it becomes identity. Sorry, I missed a slide. And instead of dealing with just names, we're dealing with electronic representations of people and other things. But we'll get to those other things later. People with names. And not just one name, but many names. And even versions of names. Think maiden names and married names. And all those names are interrelated. And not just names, but the other aspects of that person that are pertinent to the work of library. Wow. With our Google glasses on and our social media genes in place, the electronic world of library is starting to look a lot like the brick and mortar world of library, where we serve our customers every day. Gone are the artificial system constructs that interrupt our service of patrons in favor of the system's preferred lookup method. Gone are the artificial system constructs that we have to teach people, or worse yet, program around to give our users the ability to use our systems without us. So let's pause here for a moment and pull out a couple of important definitions from this dream that we need to take with us into our essential basic considerations in a moment. I suggest the first is identity. And this definition comes from the list that's posted as one of your handouts. An identity is a condition of a thing, not a thing, a condition of a thing, like a current status or a format of a resource. And it's not a label, like a name on a thing. It's inherently different from that we have cataloged to date. And we may or may not be able to get it from what we have cataloged to date. And if we can get it, we're certainly not going to get it from just one field. Ah, yes. Here's the justification from those clustering activities OCLC keeps talking about. And identity management, another definition, it's a service. It's a service that consists of many activities and tasks. And it applies not just to people, but to all those other things that enhance meaning in libraries and library services. Things like resources and subjects and rights. It feels a lot like we just might be getting to some of those essentials we need to define as part of our essence. Identity management is a service that addresses both the system's needs and the human needs together in an integrated way, as the second bullet discusses, without all of that added cost and time we have now of making humans try to figure out the crazy machine-readable stuff without any aid, and making computers try to parse and make sense of the almost human unreadable stuff that we capture in service of the system. And here you think about access control and open URLs. And it's a service that feeds context, that stuff Catherine keeps talking about. Didn't you say it had something to do with description? That it replaced description? So let's look at description and cataloging a little bit more with our Google glasses on. Description and its parent workflow cataloging, the act of filling in a bunch of unconnected fields in a card template, often by hand, by rekeying or re-entering pre-supplied data that's on the resource itself, like on the title page or in the resource itself, even in the case of an electronic resource, or on the invoices and other materials that are supplied along with that resource as part of our purchase, or embedded in the external system outputs that we get with purchase, like the Excel files from the distributor. And the list goes on. And it's the act of filling in these things against or according to a large number of detailed rules and policies. Detailed rules and policies that are designed to meet the specific requirements of the ILS as you at your specific library have implemented it. Detailed rules and policies that have to be consulted offline or sometimes via a dizzying maze of interconnections that require all of our systems to work just right at that moment. Here I'm thinking about the toolkit and the cataloger's desktop or many other tools that we might be using. And even when we use those, we're still often required to consult an offline resource or two, like our printed policy statement. And all of these tools that we're consulting to do this manual filling in are organized against magic backbones that you have to go to school to learn or be trained to use. And here I'll pause. I know I'm sounding like a bit of a heretic, but honestly, I'm the technologist that spent 6 years studying the next generation of cataloging, RDA. And there's a good number of reasons that I'm not a cataloger. And it's not because I don't like what catalogers do. It's not that I don't love metadata and all that geeky stuff. I do. It's because I can't live with the process and the systems used to do it. So when I put my Google glasses on, what does all of this headache that I'm admittedly not willing to join in with become? I think it becomes collection and enrichment. It's like going shopping, where we get to drive our cart and we assemble things others have put out there. We don't recreate and copy them. And once we assemble them, we get to enrich them. We get to add and collect and flesh out and connect those assembled things in a way that aids the services we want to provide to ourselves and our users. Instead of doing rote things by detailed processes the system requires or the collective says we must. Yep, with our Google glasses on, it becomes really simple. With the focus removed from service of our systems and change to serving our users, reduction of the amount of work required becomes almost a well done. Heck, as Catherine pointed out, Amazon and Walmart are doing it now. And I guarantee you, they aren't doing it with cataloging. It's too expensive and hard to attract enough people to do. All of which, of course, allows us to do the vital work of libraries, context management, once we put our Google glasses on, because after all, our users know, and so do we when we're not blinded by our systems, context is everything. It's the difference between, as this picture shows, a lovely romantic evening and dumpster diving. Pizza, the thing's the same in either place. It's just inherently different. It just has inherently different meaning to humans, depending on where we encounter it. So let's pause here again and pull out a couple important definitions from this dream that we need to take into our essential basic considerations in a moment. Context. Context is a relationship between things. Be those things inside or outside of our collection. It's a relationship that impacts meanings in our customers, our patrons' interactions with our collection. It's the things that tell the user if the pizza is treasure or trash. And it's part of the answers given by the librarian at the reference desk, who also frequently does the job of filling in what our systems miss or obfuscate for our users. Look at that. We're back to letting librarians be librarians again. We're back to talking about things and service. I think this dream is really starting to help us see our essential isness. But before we jump to that, let's pull out one more definition from this last visionary experience: context management. It's a service. It's a service that consists of many activities and tasks, just like identity management. It's a service that applies to things again, things which enhance meaning in libraries and library service. Wow, that pattern of essence is getting pretty strong. It's a service that addresses both the system's needs and the human's needs together in an integrated way, like identity management. And it's a service that feeds discovery, lending, and collection, the services of library. This is both intuitively obvious for that brick and mortar side of library, and yet so different, so far removed from those things we call discovery in our current systems when we don't have our Google glasses on. I'm starting to see now what Catherine and her team became so enamored of this definitions process she was talking about. It has a way of pulling the librarian and the library out of the tech gobbledygook and pile of words mire, and it makes it abundantly clear what we need to do through our platform. Hard work and headbutting required? Definitely. But I hope you'll agree with me that it's well worth it. And with these slides, we just started. There's more than we can cover in a 1-hour webinar. Take a look at your definitions list. Consider things like rights management and how it fits in with context and identity management. And certainly we'll go into all of this in a bit more detail in the next webinar and then the writings to come, but hopefully this gives you a little peek into the possibilities and starts the conversation. So let's come back out of that dream, and let's get down to the business of those essential definitions I keep talking about. Those things we need to first agree upon and then take to our stakeholders if we are together to bridge the divide between the painful realities of our systems today and the services our dreams are talking about. What are those few? Essential isness definitions, those shared interconnected expressions of who we are and what we do that guide us and our extended team members. Having worked on definitions with librarians of all stripes for over 10 years now, and definitions with other subject matter experts about the essences of their disciplines for over 20, I see a pretty simple set: library, things, and technology. And it's so convenient that this set gives us a clear, simple visual mnemonic. Library is the foundation, technology is the connector, and things are the top level that people who interact with us see first. Very true to life, too, which is a nice test on whether we got to the essentials. So let's start with library, that foundation. And let's go back to those guiding questions Catherine asked. Are libraries collectors, navigating alongside our users? Or are we service providers, offering a comprehensive set of knowledge services against what we collect and beyond, navigating alongside users, enabling navigation in a way that Google does? Or, and here's where I personally, as an experienced outside observer, want to add one more thing I don't think we talk about very much. I don't hear it talked about very much, but it seems vital. Are libraries researchers and educators, studying the discipline? Isn't that what MLIS stands for? And are they educators teaching others, those K-12 librarians teaching others to use the resources of our library? I suggest that library is all three. And I'll give you a moment to read these definitions rather than read them to you. And as you're reading and questioning, remember, we're talking about a web-based, non-system trapped world that these definitions need to live in. And remember, value in this world comes from variety that enables business cases, not from marching in lockstep. It comes from coordinated approaches that enable individual variations that allow each library to service its community or communities to the best of its ability as measured against its business cases as driven by its stated mission and funders. True, all of this is a bit different in both approach and definition that we usually see. But think about it for a few minutes. Butt heads with yourself, if you will. Is any of it untrue? Is there a good deal of fact here? The hard essential truth? Let's keep asking that hard question. Please keep asking it of yourself. And please notice some commonalities in these three things. Contracted. Libraries are contracted. They're provided that funding with a purpose. Purposes to collect, protect, warehouse, distribute resources and the scholarly record or any other record, as noted in our previous webinar, like the cultural record. And they're contracted to do this for people, members of the funding community and their designees. Does this provide the appropriate level of connectedness while allowing us the required variation? Is it a good foundation from which to define the people of library? Let's check. Given this definition of library, what's a librarian? And I'll give you again a minute to read it. Is this different than we think of? Perhaps MLIS isn't mentioned. But then, butt heads with yourself over that for a moment. Is the MLIS actually an essential part of librarianship in the library today? Is it helpful? Yes. Do we need some of them? Yes. Is everyone one? No. To me, it's kind of like pharmacists, where I have one pharmacist per shift, and that pharmacist supervises so many pharmacy techs, and together they provide a wonderful consultative service. And this definition of library It feels like it's a very nice match to those dreams, that identity and identity management we talked about before. It feels like it's more than just names. It feels like a good thing, especially when we're talking about that ROI, as it's a foundation to make people, be they staff users, patrons, authors, editors, those people we track in our system, the same thing. Wow, that's different. That's different than the complications we have in ILSs now, even the next generation ones. And it's pretty web-like, come to think of it. Wow, as an essence upon which to begin new levels of visibility and viability in a web world, and if I'm reading the tea leaves right, some important people in library, like OCLC and LD4, seem to be thinking so too. So, what about those others we need if we're talking about library people and identities, Nanette? Those others who connect our business, who impact our business and our service creation and provision. What about the library technologists? The non-librarians you talked about last week that bring complementary expertise that help us succeed when added to our team. What about those people we serve, those library patrons, willing and able members of the funding community's audience? And let's note that to get to our essence, there's a few missing here. There's some more library set definitions that we need to do. And I'll throw those out to you and hope that you start the conversation about them. What about library funders? What about library business? What about library service? So what's the foundation of library in place as our business, acknowledging that we have some extensions to do? Let's take a few minutes of the time we have left to look at the top level. Not the foundations, but the things that people see when they come in. The things they see first. The things we as librarians, and others on the library team are by definition contracted to collect, protect, warehouse, distribute, provide access to, and serve. And yes, I combined people and resources in this definition. And let's acknowledge that talking about it in this way, well, it feels a bit silly at first, a bit artificial. Come on, Nanette, let's just talk about relationship, or let's just talk about resources. And honestly, do you need to go to the Dr. Seuss metaphor? Maybe. Because let's acknowledge that we do live in the age of the internet, of things, and we're assembled for the purpose of finding visibility and viability for library in a web-based world. That is to say, an internet world. So despite how silly or childlike we feel, we can't ignore the things. For if we do, we risk creating yet another round of systems and services designed for a world that we no longer live in, which we all have to admit won't bring us to either visibility or viability. So let's look at the thing. Let's look at the truth in the thing analogy for a moment. Like thing one and thing two, and even expanded to many, many things. All things that we are contracted to do, all those activities, and all those things, those people and resources we're contracted to do them with and for, they can be defined by the same granules and in the same way at their basis level. They do indeed look very much alike on the outside. So, as we know, they, the people who wear the t-shirt, are on the inside by meaning very different. There's that context thing again, not to mention a hint at the technology part. So let's repeat the process we've been using today. Let's take a look at a proposed definition of things. Certainly this is more detailed than the other definitions we've presented so far, and it's more than we can go into in the short time we have left. But I want to introduce the idea, this way of looking at it, and allow you to butt your head against it for a while. I want to point out a few things for you to go away and think about. Let's look at just all those related words. Are those blue words, how many of them do you use every day? How many do you use the same way as all the other librarians that you interact with? How many of them do you use and then hear from the technologists on the team that they don't think all you librarians are using them the same way, and in fact, they really don't even understand what you mean by them? Can you point them to a definition Uh-oh. How many of those words, those blue underlined words, are inadequately, unintelligibly, which would say you have to know the secret language of library to understand the definition? I think there's more than a few in RDA like that. How many of them are irregularly across the different standards we use, or even worse yet, undefined in our standards and in our data? And as that person who worked on RDA, I can tell you that on release in 2010, over 50% of the words we used in our data were undefined upon release. So we're going to define some of them, or we're going to propose some, and that's what that link means. That link means that we've thought these things through. We've answered these questions, and we feel like some headbutting needs to occur in the profession. So take a look at our draft definitions on your list. Use that PDF and link between them. And look at what we're proposing. What we're proposing here is a start of a conversation. And please come back to us with the conversation. And speaking of a starting point of conversation, let's take our last few minutes to consider the connector, technology, in what we hope is plain English. Let's talk about 3 key technologies everyone's banding about today in all their presentations, and assuming that everyone knows what they mean, understands what they're saying. Linked data, structured data, and federated infrastructure. Linked data. What is it? It's just a format for distributing relationships between things. As structured data. Oops, there's a word we got to get to. But really, it's just moving that context around. What I like better, and the first time I've seen it, and I wish I'd seen this sooner, is how OCLC is defining it. How they're connecting the technology to the business, because that's what we really care about. It's a method of publishing structured data, yet we'll get there, so that it can be easily understood by computers, resulting in opportunities for improved discovery of library connections through a variety of popular sites and web services, including Google, Wikipedia, and social networks. Aha, they're wearing both their Google glasses and their social media jeans. And what about that word structured data? Well, as a technologist, I can tell you structured data is not really all that hard. It's just a standard machine-readable way to mark up content and metadata. And yeah, I did say content and metadata. Both can be structured data. Both should be structured data. At minimum, they should both be well-formed. And what does well-formed mean? It means constructed according to basic known syntax rules. Can we say that about our MARC data? I don't think so. And at best, it means being valid against a specific version of the format serialization. It's the thing that allows you to validate it, and adherent to documented standards and defined models. Right. The machine and the human have to understand it. The human has to understand in a way that connects to knowledge. That's what's modeled. So let's end then with federated infrastructure, which to my way of thinking is a great place to end, as it jumps us straight into or leads us into our final webinar, which is going to be on use cases. What is a federated infrastructure? It's an architecture that allows interoperability and sharing between semi-autonomous, decentralized, organized business systems and applications. According to our earlier conversation, that's libraries. It's a coordinated, controlled sharing and exchange of information. In library, it's the thing that we need to accomplish all of those dreams. As OCLC points out, the thing that we need at the moment, as they point out, in the stewardship of the evolving scholarly record. And yes, it's the National Digital Platform for Libraries and Museums, but it's also something simple, pulled from publishing, that we're putting out there as practice by IMT. And as I said, we'll go into that in more detail with use cases in the next round. So Catherine, with that, back to you.
Thanks, Annette. One thing that I know both of us want to reinforce is the importance of dialogue in this process. It's tremendously important to moving forward. I know that we've just spent close to an hour, about 45 minutes, sort of fire hosing. We joke that Nanette can be a little bit of a fire hose sometimes, and I think we've probably both fire hosed you this afternoon. But we want to make sure that we have dialogue, that you take time to think about what we're proposing here, and to engage with us, to engage with one another, to make these definitions as robust and comprehensive as they need to be. If you agree with particular terms or particular definitions that we've proposed, we'd like to know that we're on the mark. And if you disagree, and butting heads is okay, we'd like to know so that we can refine and improve our definitions over time. This really is a community effort, despite the fact that the voices that you've heard today are mine and Annette's. At this point, I'd like to pause for just a moment. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and I know there hasn't been a lot of activity there, but if there are any questions or any feedback that you'd like to share with us, please go ahead and feel free to take a moment to ask those questions or to respond to us via chat. And I'll mention, as you're taking a moment to do that, as we wrap up today, we'd like to invite you to the final session in the Orienteering for Libraries and Librarians series, Taking a Practice Trip, 3 Problems, 3 Solutions. In this session, we'll be focusing on some real-world use cases and introducing working software, Praxis by IMT, that addresses the challenges in each. After 2 sessions of talking the talk, we'll walk the walk with demonstrations and some discussion of those. Registration for the Tuesday, November 24th session, which runs from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. Pacific, is open on the IMT website under the News and Events menu option. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of Nanette and Kathy for taking time from your schedule today to participate in this session. Again, the recording and presentation materials will be available later this week via the resources menu on the IMT website, and we'd love to have comments and conversation on the Leap Forward blog as you think about some of the topics that we've put forward today. And so, until the 24th, I wish you visibility and viability for your library. Thank you.